That brings us to our feature presentation, and I'd like to introduce Natasha Warwick, who is our Vice President, and who will be introducing and taking questions after the presentation by our feature presentation today, Dr. Stephen Whitfield. Natasha?
All right, can everybody hear me?
Absolutely.
All right. So, like Scott said, my name is Natasha. I am the second vice president here. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Stephen real quick so that we can get to the reason that everybody's here today. So we're lucky to have Dr. Stephen Whitfield with us tonight. He is a conservation biologist and the director of terrestrial and wetlands conservation at the Audubon Nature Institute in New Orleans. There he leads conservation research projects with rare and endangered species. He has a PhD and a master's in biology from Florida International University and has more than 20 years of experience conducting conservation fieldwork all over the world, really, Latin America, Caribbean, United States. His research has included species ranging from amphibians to birds and environments ranging from tropical rainforests to urban ecosystems of South Florida. Since 2015, Dr. Whitfield has been working to build a scientific basis for the conservation and recovery of the iconic flamingo. More than a century after the last large flocks of wild birds were devastated by hunting in the late 1800s. So Dr. Whitfield is the founder and chair of the Florida Flamingo Working Group. And tonight we're going to hear all about flamingos, where we can find them, not just in Florida, but across the country. And I can't wait to hear your presentation, Stephen. Just a reminder for everybody, please stay muted and put your questions in the chat for Stephen, and we'll go over those at the end.
All right, thank you, Natasha. It's great to be here. Always great to talk about flamingos, and especially with your group because Everglades Audubon has been such an important part of the flamingo story. I really like to think about things in really long time scales. So I'm going to talk about 200 years of flamingo history in Florida. And we're all familiar with flamingos as an icon of the state of Florida. You could easily argue it is the most Florida bird. In Florida, you see flamingos everywhere as icons. They're the symbol for the Florida Lotto. They're on postcards everywhere. There's parks named after them, shopping centers named after them. But the flamingos themselves, right, are pretty rare in the state. And just to give you a little bit of background on American flamingos kind of across the Caribbean. It's one of 6 species, American flamingos or Caribbean flamingos, the species I'll be talking about today, is one of only 6 flamingo species globally. And it's the only one that's found within the United States. Their range is really throughout the Caribbean and northern South America, but they breed in colonies in coastal environments, and most of their historic nesting populations have been wiped out. So this is some information compiled by Bob Allen, who did a lot of foundational flamingo work in the early 20th century. And he documented where flamingos had formerly occurred. And as you can see, these red triangles are populations of flamingos that have been extirpated. So typically that's from hunting, but sometimes by habitat loss. So while the range of the species is pretty big, where they actually nest, the nesting habitat they use, is pretty limited to a small number of sites. And I really got involved in this project shortly after I started working at Zoo Miami, because I was asked to help with this bird that made the local newspaper in the Florida Keys. So this is a flamingo. Ultimately, we named this bird Conky after the Conch Republic where he first showed up. Conky landed in a shallow wetland on the Naval Air Station in Key West. So he was right next to these runways where fighter jets were taking off for whatever they do with them. And this newspaper article was really interesting to me because as iconic as flamingos are in Florida, they're so rare that when one showed up, it made a news story. And this news article actually had a lot of really good questions that were kind of like Florida Flamingo 101. Why is this flamingo here? Where do they come from? Do they belong here or not? And is this a conservation issue? And so, these are great questions, but normally we know this about bird species that occur in Florida, especially bird species that are famous. So the zoo had been working to try to capture flamingos and equip them with satellite transmitters. And so they asked me to help with this. So we got a kayak and a flamingo crate, which is the kind of thing that you have when you work at a zoo. And we drove down to the Naval Air Station. And you can see the Naval Air Base on the right. There's that crisscross of runways with shallow wetlands across them. And normally, when birds show up into those wetlands, they drive them away so they don't collide with planes, because that can kill the birds, damage the planes, possibly, kill the pilot. Um, so they have someone on the base who works for USDA, and her job is to chase away birds. If the birds won't leave after several days of harassment, they usually end up shooting them so that they don't get killed by the planes or cause harm to the planes themselves. But no one wants to shoot a flamingo. So they reached out to Zoo Miami to try to help remove this flamingo and help put it someplace where it's more appropriate to live. But when we got out there, the Naval Air Station, their job is to launch planes off the runways. And when we, the biology team, were out trying to catch this flamingo, they had to shut down their flights. So they weren't going to give us a lot of time to do this. But we got out there, and here's a little video of the first time I really saw conky. And you can see how fast the water is moving. There's a lot of wind. This gives you a picture for like the kind of area that conky was in. And so we were out there for a couple days trying to catch this bird. And it was increasingly clear that we just didn't have with the zoo the skills or resources we needed to catch it. So we reached out to this guy you see on the left there. That's Thomas Sweets from the Key West Wildlife Center. He does a lot of work capturing injured birds, rehabbing them, and releasing them. And he's got this nice piece of equipment called a net gun. And here he's crouched down, pointing the net gun at Conky. So this net gun uses air to fire a net at relatively short range. And it's a common tool used in wildlife biology. But as we were trying to capture this bird, the folks at the Naval Air Station were getting more and more frustrated with their inability to capture the bird quickly. So just before this photo was taken, the folks from the airbase told us we had until about noon this day to capture the bird, or they were just going to shoot it and be done with it. So this photo is from about 11 a.m. that day, when we were trying to herd conky within net range of Thomas. And this is the photo that was taken just before we actually got the bird into the net gun. And so this is tricky because once the bird is in the net, it's in shallow water, the bird could drown. So we have to be quick recovering it from the net. But we were very happy that we were able to capture this bird. And when we got ready to release it, our plan was to release it in Everglades National Park. There were a couple of other flamingos there at the time, and because the bird was so social, we thought that that would be a good place for it. But when we asked FWC if we could release conky in Everglades National Park, they told us that we couldn't because flamingos are not native to Florida. And Florida's full of non-native species. We who live there are all familiar with that. But FWC's policy was that whenever their opinion, their biological opinion, was that whenever flamingos are seen around Florida, they're escapes from captive populations. And in particular, the population they were concerned about is the Hialeah racetrack. The Hialeah racetrack, the management of the racetrack brought in flamingos in the 1920s. They started nesting, and they've been breeding there ever since. There's still probably about 100 flamingos out there today. They don't nest every year, but they nest occasionally, and the birds are flighted, so they can leave. But FWC's opinion was that whenever flamingos are seen around Florida, they're escapes from Hialeah or other captive populations. And in terms of wildlife management, what we want to do with non-native species is remove them from the landscape. We certainly don't want to launch population recovery programs to help them return. So it was really confusing for the status of flamingos to be in such chaos. It wasn't clear if they were actually a native species or not. And that's remarkable given how iconic and famous they are. So FWC's idea that all the flamingos around are non-native was in contrast to the opinion of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where a group of biologists back in 2006 actually stated that American flamingos are native, and they listed them as a species that are in desperate need of population recovery efforts. And so this was really interesting because these are polar opposites in terms of the way we would view flamingos and what we would suggest to do with their management, right? They're non-native, they need to be removed. If they are native, but there's so few of them, then we need to help encourage them to come back. And part of the problem with this was that the last real effort to evaluate what's going on with flamingos was done back in the 1950s. We have new resources, new ideas, new approaches to wildlife conservation since then. And this information was just really out of date. So what I started to do to really find out the history of flamingos in Florida was to delve into accounts by early naturalists. Just after the US acquired Florida from Spain, the first thing that they did was sent someone down to assess the natural resources of the state. They sent John Lee Williams, who wrote a manuscript called The Territory of Florida. And he goes through and describes all the things that people can eat, all of the natural resources around. And he mentions flamingos. So you can see on the bottom right here, he says this elegant bird was seen in large flocks south of the 28th degree of north latitude, particularly on the Gulf side of the peninsula. He describes them in enough detail that we can be clear that they're not spoonbills. And then this very last statement, they are excellent food. So what Williams was there to do was to look for things for people to eat, to encourage people from the US to move to Florida, to settle its new territory. And so he suggested flamingos would be a good food source for people moving to Florida. In the 1830s, maybe about a decade after John Lee Williams, Audubon himself went down to Florida. He was specifically looking for flamingos, and he accounts describing them in the Florida Keys. In the mid 1800s, Gustavus Verdeman from the Smithsonian Institution was sent down to collect some flamingos in the Florida Keys for the Natural History Museum at Smithsonian. And he comes up with a really detailed account of flamingos in the Keys. He went out with a local hunter. They reported killing more than 100 flamingos in a day. And he mentions that the hunter he went out with kills flamingos and brings them back to Key West for food. So this is a guy who's basically doing what John Lee Williams suggested someone do. They go out and they hunt flamingos and use them for food. In the later 1800s, the plume trade emerges. And flamingos are hunted not just for food, but for feathers. And lots of the wading bird populations were devastated in South Florida from plume hunting. There's very few accounts of people going out with plume hunters, but one of these, Charlie Pierce, went out with some plume hunters and published a, a manuscript called The Cruise of the Bonbon. And in this, he reports seeing flocks of flamingos in the Florida Keys. And he also mentions that flamingos had the highest dollar value per skin of any bird species in South Florida. So this actually gives an economic incentive, some kind of economic data to why people may want to kill them in the late 1800s. There's a lot of accounts in the very late 1800s, 1880 or beyond, that describe flamingos in South Florida, but their numbers start dropping really year over year. And around this time, the naturalists who report flamingos start saying, if we don't control hunting, these things are going to disappear from Florida. So this is the first real sentiment that the flamingos need to be protected and that hunting is going to wipe them out. We also wanted to look at physical evidence. So these written accounts are great, but natural history museums are full of specimens of birds collected around the US. And today, many natural history museums have their collections digitized. So I could do a simple search and come up with a list of flamingos that were found in Florida before the population in Hialeah was established, right? So here on the left, I have a list of some of these birds. They all have a specimen number, the way they're categorized, they're cataloged in the Natural History Museum. And a lot of these records have dates. Gustavus Verdeman was one of the guys who I mentioned went out with a hunter and collected 100 birds in a day. So there's actual some of those 100 birds that are still preserved in a natural history museum. A number of these other folks had accounts of flamingos, of describing flamingos as well. So we know that they weren't confusing flamingos with spoonbills. But then you can see these records become a lot more rare in the 1900s, and very rare in the present century. Excuse me one second. I have a cat. Um, this is additional evidence that flamingos were present in Florida long before the population in Hialeah was established. We were also really interested in whether the flamingos were just flying in every once in a while from somewhere around the Caribbean, or if they actually nested here. And as many of you all may know, flamingos build these kind of volcano-shaped nests out of mud, and they build them in dense groups. And there was one possible eyewitness account of flamingos nesting in the Keys in the early 20th century. Someone reported to Alexander Sprunt, an important ornithologist in Florida, that he saw while hunting on Tavernier, while hunting on Sugarloaf Key, he saw flamingos sitting on what he thought were whitish stumps. And that's not something that flamingos really do, but Sprunt interpreted this as if flamingos were actually sitting on their nests that were white because they were whitewashed or baked from the marl. So this is possible, but it's not really conclusive evidence for sure that flamingos were nesting in Florida. But again, these natural history museums, because they have information digitized, we can go through and search for egg specimens collected in Florida over the past couple centuries. And this is strange, but in the late 1800s, collecting eggs was a common hobby among naturalists. You may think of it as kind of like Pokemon Go of the late 1800s. People went around looking for rare bird eggs. They would take meticulous notes on where they found them. And many of these eggs ended up in natural history museums. It turns out that these egg collections are a really important scientific resource. They help understand shifts in the timing of nesting of birds as environmental conditions change. And they've also been really useful in helping understand how DDT caused eggshell thinning that was causing declines in bird populations in the 20th century. So when we went through and looked for flamingo eggs collected in Florida, we actually came up with 4 different collection events by different observers in different years in the 1880s. So each of these, I was given a photograph of the eggs by the Natural History Museums, as well as the data cards that come with them. So in some cases, the data is really good, tells us exactly the date that the eggs were collected, who collected them, and other information like that. In some cases, the information is not so good. It may just say South Florida. But collectively, what this tells us is that if any of these eggs, um, all of these eggs really point to the fact that flamingos were historically nesting in Florida. So collectively, when we put all this historical evidence together, based on the accounts of early naturalists, there was a population estimate of 1,000 to 2,500 birds in Florida. There were flocks present really all through the year, but by around 1900, they were extirpated under heavy evidence of hunting for meat and feathers. And so this is not what we think of as a population history for a non-native species. This is a population history consistent with things like American crocodiles, manatees, Florida panthers, all species that we protected and have launched conservation recovery programs for to recover them from the hunting of that time. So we wanted to also kind of get a feel for more recent trends in flamingo populations. And a number of community science programs, like the Christmas bird count and eBird, have tracked flamingos among rare bird observations. And these are great because they're already digitized. I can just write to Audubon headquarters and ask for the flamingo observations in Florida and the Christmas bird count. The eBird data is really easy to download. But one really important resource for this early information was kind of the old way of reporting eBird information, which was writing in rare bird reports to basically Audubon Central, who would publish them each year in what was called Audubon Field Notes. And so I went through these and digitized all the information about flamingos in Florida to try to come up with a really long history, a really long time series of the number of flamingos in Florida over a given period. And so we were able to come up with data ranging from 1950 to 2015. That's a 65-year time period. And we can count flamingos in a number of ways. The total number of people who saw flamingos is the figure A. Figure B is the total number of flamingos seen in a given year. And figure C is the maximum group size of flamingos. The gray line is a 5-year moving average. And so these are really crude estimates, but this was the kind of data that no one had put together before. And what it shows is that any way you look at the number of flamingos, it's increasing from that period of 1950 to 2015. But it never gets back to the original population sizes we saw in the 1800s, as described by early naturalists. So this, the easiest way to interpret this is that flamingos were declining across the Caribbean because there was hunting pressure. A lot of places like Bahamas, Cuba, and Mexico have invested in flamingo recovery programs, and their populations are growing. So the easiest way to explain these numbers is that flamingos are coming back to Florida as they recover around the rest of their range. But you could argue that maybe just more and more flamingos escape from Hialeah each year. So it's important for us to figure out where flamingos are coming from. And there were a number of approaches, including looking at banding records, using stable isotopes and population genetics, or using telemetry to figure out where flamingos are actually from. And so when we were putting this together, we were able to find 3 records of banded birds, all of which came from the Yucatan of Mexico. Now, especially after 2023, there are far more than 3 observations. But interestingly, all of these come from the Yucatan of Mexico, and none of them come from Cuba or the Bahamas, where there were other banding programs. And then a second method we can use are stable isotopes. So stable isotopes are a really important way to track the movement of matter around an ecosystems. And they have a number of applications for understanding ecosystems and understanding organisms. So for example, if I had a hair sample from everyone in this Zoom meeting today, I could do some lab work that tells me who's a vegetarian versus who eats the most meat, because that shows up in the stable isotope signature. I could tell you who lives in Florida year round versus who's only in Florida for half the year, because the isotope signatures of Florida are different from other parts of the US. And I could tell you who eats a largely seafood-based diet versus who doesn't eat seafood much at all. And so these are things that you can test using a very small sample. And so I was able to access feather samples from natural history museums, from flamingos across the range of the species, and from birds in captive populations like zoos. And I was able to do some work that really tries to figure out, if we have flamingos of unknown origin in Florida, where are they from? Are they escapes from Hialeah, or do they look like they have the isotopic signatures of actual wild birds? So this is some science about what we did. What I'll show you here, this data, the purple points are the isotopic signatures of wild birds. And you can see that they all cluster together. The green points are the isotopic signatures of captive birds from Zoo Miami, from Lion Country Safari, and from the Hialeah racetrack. And you can see that they all clustered together as well. So we can tell using this method whether a bird is wild or captive. And then these orange points, you see this one down here is Conky, because we got a feather sample off of him. A couple of these others are birds that landed in Florida and died. And then these snakebite birds were collected by a field technician who followed a flock of flamingos around in snakebite, collecting feathers that they dropped as he followed them for a couple of days. So the points that cluster in the purple, those are wild birds. But the ones in green, those are birds that are almost certainly escapes from Hialeah. So probably the historical birds through the 20th century come from both captive and wild sources. We also did some population genetic work to try to understand if there are genetic differences between captive and wild birds, or if there are differences in flamingo genetics across the range of the species. And essentially what we found is that all of the flamingos around the Caribbean are basically one homogeneous mix. So there's not really differentiation between flamingos in the Yucatan or Cuba or the Bahamas. And we also found that birds from captive populations are essentially genetically indistinguishable from wild birds. This will be important later on. So we were able to give a lot of this information in an early stage to FWC, who wouldn't let us release Conky. Eventually they said, okay. There's enough of a question that it's worth you releasing the bird with a transmitter. So we released Conky out in Everglades National Park and at Snakebite, actually. These are photos just after his release. And what we were hoping is that Conky would leave Florida and go to Cuba, go to Mexico, go to the Bahamas, go wherever flamingos go, so that finally we'll have some telemetry data that tells us where flamingos in Florida come from. And unfortunately, Conky never left Florida. He was out in Florida Bay for 2 years before his transmitter ultimately failed. So here on the right, I have a map of Florida Bay. Snake Bite and the Flamingo Visitor Center are the large red box there. And each of those white points is a satellite location, a satellite fix from where Conkey was while he was out. The orange blobs are where Conkey spent 50% of his time or more, and the yellow blobs are where he spent 95% of his time. So this kind of shows you the amount of space that a flamingo would need in Florida. And the orange circles show you really important habitats for flamingos. And so it's probably not a surprise to folks here that snake bite is a really important flamingo habitat. But these three keys down at the bottom, Club Key, Bob Allen Key, and Stake Key, aren't places that we expected to see flamingos. These are mangrove-fringed islands in Florida Bay that have a really shallow, muddy, kind of salty ponds on them. And so it looks like good flamingo habitat, but because they're fringed by mangroves, you would never see into these into the wetlands in there if you were driving by on a boat. So Conkey told us, while he didn't tell us where flamingos go, he did tell us what kinds of habitats flamingos like in Florida Bay. And so the top left here is snake bite. The top right and bottom left are kind of shallow banks between individual keys. And then the bottom right is that wetland out in the middle of those keys in Florida Bay. And one of the things that was great about Conkey is that we would get photos of him with other birds. Just a couple months after we released him, we got our first photo of Conkey with friends. And this is a photo from Snakebite in July of 2017, where he was seen with two other birds regularly out in Snakebite for a while. So this is great because this tells us Conkey's not alone. We don't get this kind of information from satellite transmitters, but it is really useful information to know that he's making friends. Unfortunately, Conkey's transmitter died in July or August of 2017. This was just after Hurricane Irma swept through and did a lot of damage to the Keys and to Florida Bay. So we think that Conkey probably left Florida Bay after the disruption from Hurricane Irma. But what he has told us, while he hasn't told us anything about where flamingos go to outside of Florida, he did provide really important information on habitat use and shows that we can effectively use satellite transmitters to follow flamingo movements. So we put a lot of this information together, the historical information describing the status and trends of flamingos in Florida. And we had this published in 2018. This was really important because it was really kind of a synthesis of what we knew about flamingos in Florida. And it really aimed at dispelling this myth, this kind of erroneous idea that flamingos are all non-native, that they're all escapes from captive populations. As a scientist, I really want to see that my science has an impact. I don't expect a lot of people to read this publication, but if I'm doing my job as a conservation biologist right, the research that I do in these abstract publications will lead to some policy change. And so shortly after we published this paper, we got a lot of press attention for the paper. Journalists were asking us why flamingos were considered to be non-native, and I kept referring them to this webpage from FWC. A couple days after our paper was published, after this media attention was kind of all over the place, this website went from what you see here to this. So FWC has never made an official statement that they were wrong about this status. They now deny that this website ever existed. So this is a screenshot that a journalist actually found for me after FWC was saying that it didn't exist. So they really did say this. But it was good that this was an important step, because then dispelling that idea that all flamingos are non-native to Florida really lets us get into some conservation work. So we had that study published in May of 2018, and in June of 2018, we submitted a petition to Florida to add flamingos to their official list of threatened species. And this was important because if the state actually listed flamingos as a threatened species, they would have to put some effort into species recovery behind flamingos. So that could look a number of different ways, but they would need to acknowledge this is a species that's declined because of humans, and that it would compel the state to actually take action to bring the species back. So the way this process works is FWC finds a group of external biologists who aren't on our petition, and it requests that they do a review and make a recommendation to the state. So that panel of biologists suggested that flamingos do warrant listing as a threatened species in Florida, and then the process goes through FWC's internal review. Ultimately, FWC ignored the recommendations of the scientists it chose itself and declined to list flamingos as a threatened species. Part of the reason for that is they said there's less than 1,000 individuals within the state, less than 1% of the global population occurs in Florida, and existing protections and ongoing management are in place. And those are all true, but I can't imagine, but I think this argumentation is kind of weak. Still, this petition did compel FWC to put out a biological status report, and this corrects those misconceptions about the population history. It acknowledged our scientific paper from 2018, which shows that it was hunting that drove the flamingos out of Florida. They stated that FWC will coordinate monitoring, though that, to my knowledge, has still not happened. And it identified scientific knowledge gaps that we really need to understand better how to manage flamingos. And then importantly, it states that if the status of flamingos does change, if they return to nest here, or flamingo populations around the Caribbean are impacted by hurricanes or sea level rise, for example, they may reconsider whether it's necessary to help populations recover in Florida. And so while FWC said that they weren't going to lead population recovery efforts, at that time, I decided that we should just do it ourselves. So I reached out to the experts that FWC had asked to be on their panel, and I asked them if they wanted to form a Florida Flamingos working group. So a number of us got together. We've been having meetings ever since FWC declined to list this decision, declined to list the species as threatened, and we have been forming our own plans for how to help flamingos recover in Florida. And here's a little bit of what our vision looks like. So this is a timeline. There's the work that I told you about that's completed. We have our status and trends paper. We published the work on conky and telemetry. And on the right is our goal. We want population recovery, similar numbers to the historical data that we have. I mentioned a couple of the things that we've got ongoing, the genomics work, which we hope will be published this year, the work on stable isotopes, which we hope will be published this year. We've also identified things that we need that would lead us to population recovery. At any time, as long as the habitat is there, flamingos may just fly in and decide that Florida is a good place to live, and they may nest on their own. So that natural recolonization is always an option, but that's not something that we can control the timeline of. It's something that we can pay attention to by seeing how many flamingos are around in Florida and increasing our effort on monitoring so we know. Another thing would be facilitated recolonization through creating artificial nests. In other places, in um, in uh, in species of flamingos in the Mediterranean and in Africa, when biologists have wanted flamingos to return to nest in a historic breeding ground, one of the things that they've done is just create fake nests. So the biologists go out and they make volcano-like nests out of mud. And when flamingos see a bunch of those in a group, in their little flamingo brains, they say, this is where flamingos nest. So they'll start building their own nest there. And if we can determine with real confidence what good nesting locations look like, that might be something that we can do that's relatively low effort that gets flamingos to return to locations they used to nest in. And the other thing that may be an option is translocation or reintroductions. So either releasing flamingos from captive populations, because we know that the flamingos in zoos are genetically indistinguishable from flamingos around the Caribbean, or by bringing flamingos in from one part of the range and releasing them in South Florida. There's a number of steps we need to figure out before we do any of these active conservation measures. One thing is that if we're placing flamingos in a location or we're encouraging them to nest there, we really need to make sure that those locations have enough food to support the flamingos we're bringing in. Otherwise, there's no real effort in the work. And we also really need to evaluate what looks like really good nesting habitat so that if we're trying to encourage flamingos to nest here, we know specifically where to do it. So these are things that we're working on. As we've been planning all of these things, as many of you all know, in 2023, Hurricane Idalia brought huge numbers of flamingos to the US, more than we've seen in since the 19th century. And so just to give you a little glimpse of what that looks like, on the top here are all of the eBird reports for flamingos in Florida in 2022. And on the bottom right is the flamingos in the eastern US in 2023. So this is a pretty crude estimate of numbers, but as you can see, that's a really big increase in a very short amount of time. So what this may indicate is that that natural recolonization that we had in our recovery plan, that may happen sooner than we think. It's hard to know if the birds that flew in 2023 have stuck around or if they will nest here, but it's really important that we monitor those things so that we have some idea how to optimize our conservation investment. And then the last thing that I want to mention, a couple more things. One of those birds that did fly in, famously known now as Peaches, was rescued off Port DeSoto after Hurricane Idalia, found floating in the water, unable to get out. He was released with a transmitter and a color band, and so this is the second bird with a satellite transmitter that's been released in Florida. And one important lesson from this is that Peaches was harassed by people around Fort DeSoto. So while with Conkey, we were really kind of forthcoming about where Conkey is at any given time. With Peaches, that data has not been publicly available because we're worried that people will harass him again. And the last thing that we've been working on in the working group, we've been talking about this for a long time, but putting together an effort to change the state bird of Florida from the mockingbird to the flamingo. And right now, we have bills in the House and Senate that would officially replace the mockingbird with the American flamingo as a state bird. And our flamingo working group has been writing letters to papers. We've been lobbying legislators. The Miami Herald has actually endorsed the flamingo for the state bird. So it's really exciting to see this change from a bird that less than 10 years ago was considered to be an escape from captive populations to now having legitimate consideration of what helping flamingos recover in Florida and return so we can all see them and enjoy them would actually be like. From being a bird that was considered a non-native species by our state wildlife agency to being considered the state bird by our legislature. So that's a pretty big shift in our mindset on flamingos in under a decade. And that's where I'll leave it. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Stephen. That was really interesting. So everybody, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I like that your cat made a cameo appearance. All right, so the first comment we have on the presentation is from Maria. She says that she's just so proud that Audubon Everglades was a supporter of the 2018 petition.
Me
The next
too.
question.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Next question comes from Brian Garrett. It's more of a comment, really. So he says, in 2014, the South Florida Water Management District had a very large group of flamingos show up out at STA2, and he knows that you got out there to see them several times. It was in the early days of trying to catch a flamingo, so before Conky, and there was an estimated around 147 flamingos there for a few months. So he's like, how many escaped flamingos can occur before Hialeah doesn't have any flamingos left?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. And I think the high counts for their population was maybe around 300, and we just don't have very good tracking of their numbers. And they may have those numbers, but they haven't released them. But I would imagine if they did lose 150 flamingos in a day, they'd notice.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he does say, he says, I asked this sarcastically. So
Right.
all right,
Good
next
point, good point.
question. Next question is from Kim Cavendish. She says, given that they nest on the ground, how will sea level rise affect this species?
Yeah. So not just that, but every place that they nest, every nesting site in the range of the species is at sea level. So sea level rise is going to affect the nesting biology of the species. And it's not something that we're just expecting for the future, but it's probably something that's happening already. So we don't have really good tracking for flamingo populations around the Caribbean. But what we do know is that in many years, if there's like an unusually large amount of rainfall or a storm surge, it can flood the nests and cause entire colonies to experience like zero breeding success. We also know that because they nest where it's wet, if it dries out too much, that drought can lead to complete collapse of nesting in a year. And it seems like those things are getting more common. And so that's one part of it. But another part of it is that it seems like flamingos are really slow to start nesting in places they used to nest in decades ago. Like they may try to find a new place, but if the nesting requirements aren't perfect, they won't be successful. So it's not an easy thing for them to establish a new nesting colony because the environmental conditions have to be so perfect.
So you had mentioned artificial nesting habitat. is that something that's been tried or been done in other places? Because you said their little flamingo brains will be like, oh, other flamingos nest here. So is that something that could be attempted in areas where we know flamingos are nesting to see if that would be successful at moving them to higher places?
Yes, so it has been done with greater flamingos in the Mediterranean and with lesser flamingos in southern Africa, and it worked. It works surprisingly well for something that's like playing in the mud for a couple days. Um, but again, because the nesting sites have to be so perfect, right? They can't be too wet, they can't be too dry. We don't want to try that unless we know we have like a primo nesting location. Because the worst thing we want to do is draw them into a site where the nests fail.
Makes sense. All right, so next question is from Josh. He says, what can we do to help make the flamingo the state bird?
Um, Call your legislators. We're at a very critical time right now. But call your legislators. If we don't make it this year, I think we're going to try again next year. So we'll have more time to plan. But um, we've thought about all sorts of kind of outreach things we can do to get it more on legislators' minds. But
All
yeah.
right. Mark says, great, what a great summary of your very important work. Maria Wolf has, she's like, what about having school children write letters to politicians asking them to make the flamingo the state bird?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Um, I think even better than just letters. I showed in my first slide all of those Florida flamingo postcards. It's easy to not look at a letter, but you could see postcards handwritten by kids without having to dig through your mail, right? So that also kind of emphasizes that flamingos are a Florida thing already, which is one of the arguments we were making, is that they are the most iconic bird in the state. So just make it official.
Cherry Patillo says, have you worked or visited with any flamingo organizations in the Yucatan since your move to Louisiana, other than those arriving from the hurricane?
No, but we do have a number of folks from um, I've been in touch with folks in the Yucatan as well as the Bahamas, and really across the range of the species. So we're coordinating with them through the working group.
So Bob, our cats saw each other. Bob Branham says, is FWC cooperating with your efforts now?
Um, Not as much as we would like them to. We think that they're more receptive to working with us since the large influx from Adalia, but they um, have not been as uh, they have not been as enthusiastic about flamingo population recovery as the working group is, which I think is a shame.
So Cherry has another comment. She says, thanks for the historical research efforts and to all the members of the Flamingo Studies group. I echo that sentiment. Um, Jeff says, when we moved to West Miami in 1954, there were many flamingos everywhere. Everywhere. We went near the Everglades and at the horse racing track in Hialeah. Also, I've been to Lake Nakura in Kenya in the 70s, and there were thousands of flamingos there.
Cool.
I never thought about
Cool.
flamingos being everywhere.
Yeah.
Carol, oh, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, no. I just agree with your sentiment. Yeah.
So Carol, I'm butchering names. I'm sorry. I'll just say Carol. So the ABA podcast has reported a lot recently about the curiously large number of rare bird alerts of flamingos seen in numerous places around the country, far from Florida. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was um, I can't tell you why they ended up in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, right? That seems really unusual. But it was definitely that they got swept up with Hurricane Idalia, and that same event that dumped so many of them in Florida kind of scattered them in low numbers across a lot of the eastern US.
All right, so Lorraine would like to say, or she says, if the population of roseate spoonbills in Florida Bay is a barometer of the health of the bay, would that also indicate favorable habitat future for flamingos?
So we assume that if Florida in the 1800s was suitable habitat for flamingos, then Everglades restoration, getting us back to more of those historical conditions, would be better for flamingos as well. We don't have data to show that, but that's kind of one of our guiding principles on that just makes sense to us. So, yeah.
Cherry says that the Riverbank Zoo created concrete nests with wettable mud nearby and have successfully raised many young.
Yeah, zoos as well know a lot about like what it takes to encourage flamingos to nest. And one of the things they do is if they want to encourage nesting, they'll build nests. Another thing that zoos do that I think is interesting, but probably not relevant to the field. Flamingos, as colonial wading birds, they need a certain number of flamingos around to encourage nesting. So one of the tricks that zoos use is to sometimes just put up mirrors around their flamingo colony. And then the flamingos think there are more of them around and they're more likely to nest. But we know based on zoo data, the greater number of flamingos you have in a flock, the more likely you are to have nesting. So just a handful of birds is probably not going to nest, which is why we need in Florida numbers. Yeah,
That's really interesting about the mirrors.
I know.
Scott Zucker, he says, where do you expect the flamingos that were scattered by Adalia to end up? Do you think that they will return to Florida and the Caribbean?
So I think most of them have probably come south through Florida and left. It's really hard to know. Um, and this is why I mentioned in response to our petition, FWC said that they were going to monitor flamingos. And I I, I love that eBird is used as our source for tracking flamingos because that is participatory science, right? That's why it's so important that people report those observations because that is an important source of information for us as scientists. But it would be better if FWC actually was doing the monitoring that they said they would, so that we could answer questions like, what is happening to these flamingos that came in with the Dahlia? Because right now, the eBird data is all we have. And it's great data, but it's not perfect. So
Scott also says that neither House Bill 753 and Senate Bill 918 to make the flamingo the state bird have advanced since January 11th.
yes. And the House bill still has to get through one more committee, and it may not. So that's where our hangup is with the House, really.
All right. Kim Cavendish says that she's glad to see that her fellow bird lovers also have cats. Sabina asks, why do you think Conkey was attracted to the saline ponds in the Keys?
That's a great question. And we've had a lot of conversations in the working group about why that is. But one of the things that like keeps us from coming up with a good answer is that those lagoons or salt ponds or whatever you want to call them, they're just really poorly studied. Um, the salinity can vary, the water depth can vary. I really have no idea like what the food environment is like out there. but it seems like it looks like flamingo habitat elsewhere in the range of the species. So I, I think that's a great question, but I just don't know.
Susan says that she visited the Brevard Zoo today and is wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about their population and will they reproduce?
So yes, um, zoos around the U.S. kind of collectively manage our flamingos as one big flock. And so, I think this is true for a lot of a lot of species in zoos. Um, for example, if the Brevard Zoo has an excess of flamingo chicks, they'll send some off to other zoos, and we track those pedigrees so that when we arrange breeding pairs, we make sure that we control the genetics. I don't know about the specifics of the Brevard Zoo, but I think it's very likely that they are breeding there. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know the details on that.
Amy Egan says, is there a risk that greater numbers of flamingos in the state could negatively impact other types of wading birds? So, for example, by competing for food or nesting habitat.
So I think that's unlikely because flamingos are weird in a way that most wading birds are not. Flamingos are essentially filter feeders, which is not a foraging strategy that most other wading birds use. And other wading birds just wouldn't use the same habitats, right? So they'd be nesting up in trees, definitely not nesting down on the ground. So I think the chance that there's competition effects would be pretty low.
Greg Braun says, great presentation. Thank you so much. And that he's hoping to see flamingos next week in the Turks and Caicos, where they're fairly common at specific sites on several different islands. Greg, if you
Great.
see any
Best of luck.
pictures, yeah, take some pictures, share them with us
Look for
next month.
conky. It could be anywhere.
So Lorraine says, a quick look on eBird shows only one American flamingo north of Florida seen in South Carolina in early February and one report in Alabama. All others are now in Florida.
Yep. For a lot of the range, because it got cold, right? They're certainly not going to stick around in Ohio. And I don't blame them. But it's not clear that they're going to all accumulate in Florida or whether they're going to continue flying south once they get here.
Marge says, Stephen, would you find flamingos, spoonbills, egrets, and herons someday all mingling together?
I think you already do in some places. Yeah.
Okay. So like the images that we see, because usually like you see the flamingos kind of like alone. So that's kind of what motivated her question. So why do you think we see them kind of like alone versus in bigger groups, or is that just like because it makes a better picture?
Yeah, I don't know about that actually. Um, um, maybe when flamingos are around, that's just what people pay attention to because they're big and pink and rare.
Sabina says this was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Sandy says that they're also trying to make the scrub jay the state bird.
I love that we live in a state that has so many good birds that I, I'd love to see the legislature discuss birds more. So yeah.
So Lorraine says, thanks again, Stephen, for a wonderful presentation. We applaud your efforts and wish you success. That's the last question in the chat. If anybody else has anything, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat. But with that, I'll say, thanks so much for taking the time for presenting for us today. This was a really great presentation. And Scott, if you have anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Steve. That was a wonderful presentation. And as you can tell by the questions and comments, Everyone loved it. And thanks for your time. And you're welcome back again. And I think this is the second or the third time you've spoken to us, Steve.
I don't remember. It could be the third.
I think it's the third, actually. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, wonderful presentation. I mean, everyone always loves hearing about flamingos, and I'm sure that there'll be more news ahead as things progress. And I just have one more question. I realize that the legislature, of course, is now considering it as a state bird. But is there anything else we can do in terms of FWC and kind of encouraging them to do more?
Yeah, so I haven't thought that much about that since 2023. But one thing I will say, please report your flamingo observations on eBird. It's so important to be able to track what we think is a population recovery underway. And we're talking about so kind of expanding on the working group in a way that we can in part kind of capture more uh, interest and enthusiasm in the species. But we're not quite at a point where I can talk about that yet. So
Okay.
I I recognize and appreciate that folks want to contribute. And I think that's something that we need to be doing a better job of kind of creating outlets for the working group.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing more from you about that and how we as a chapter can help.
Right.
So thank you, Stephen. It was a great evening. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. And I hope you have a great night. And it was great. It was great seeing your cat, by the way, as part of it, because I saw you constantly petting the cat. It was great. It was nice. It was nice to have an extra person attending, extra being attending, I should say. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our wonderful team for tonight's presentation. Amaline Cook, Mark Slifkin, Autumn Quixote, Natasha Warwick, Mary Young, Serish Cook, and Sabina Begg, who leads our programs team, and we couldn't do this without her, all helping to bring you these virtual presentations. And we can't wait to see you on April 2nd, when Mark Cook will be presenting on a scientist with a camera, capturing the light for ecological and conservation storytelling. He'll be doing our next presentation. See you all April 2nd. In the meantime, enjoy the birds, enjoy nature, enjoy yourselves, and have a great night. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.